So today we're going to be taking a look at creating out a jack-o'-lantern from a standard image of a pumpkin. To start out with, we have a transparent background with our pumpkin. If I take a look over my layers panel, if I were to hide this layer, you can see that it disappears. But this will give us the ability to be able to cut out a section and eventually take out pieces and build along to create out our own jack-o'-lantern. But for building out the process, we want to start out with some standard shapes, and in this video we're going to do the basics of using the polygon and lasso tool and then get more advanced into using the pen tool. And each has their own benefit, but the pen tool gives a little bit better control dealing with curves, while the polygon and lasso tool is a little bit faster, gives us a little bit more just speed in assembling out a basic standard jack-o'-lantern. So to begin with, we're going to first look to duplicate our layer 0 over in the layers panel down the bottom right side. We're going to right click on this layer and duplicate layer. I'm just going to rename this jack-o'-lantern so I can identify it. This layer 0 down at the bottom we do want to hide so it doesn't interfere to deleting out portions of our jack-o'-lantern, and we will use this later on to eventually assemble a more complicated jack-o'-lantern. So clicking on the eye icon makes it invisible, and we can come back and reveal it later on. But now if I have the jack-o'-lantern and click off the visibility here, you see it disappears. Once we do have the jack-o'-lantern, we want to create a new layer for our background. And for right now, I'm just going to do a standard black background. Rename it just to keep my layers organized. I can go over to the left side navigation and fill this in with the paint bucket tool. My current foreground color is set to black. I can either click inside the area, we still fill in with black, and then I'm going to just move this layer underneath of my jack-o'-lantern. Once we have the black background, we're going to select back on our jack-o'-lantern layer, and we're going to add a layer mask. Down at the bottom of the layers panel, we should see layer mask is the white square with a little black circle inside. And we're using this to help protect our image, but offer us the ability to fix something if later on we decide that we want to make changes. So adding a layer mask, a white box appears next to our jack-o'-lantern image over in the layers panel. And this will help again to protect it. And we'll see that the white area of this box represents the live area, what can be seen. And if I take out any aspect of this pumpkin, when I have this white box selected and I hit backspace, you see this little black area be cut out from this area. Doesn't mean that this pumpkin is cut out completely. We can always recover it. If I go over to the paint bucket tool, I have white on the foreground, black on the background, and I click inside. It just paints that area back in, making it the live area that we can see over in our layer mask. So for right now, I'm just going to deselect, and we're going to look to build out our pieces for cutting out our jack-o'-lantern. I'm going to start by going over to the polygon and lasso tool. With the polygon and lasso tool, I'm going to start with a simple triangular shape, clicking point by point. Once I have this area drawn out, I can simply hit backspace or delete, depending on if you're on Mac or PC. But you see that it cuts out that area, and in this layer mask, we see the little black triangle now revealed inside of this white area. Make sure we're not getting a cutout on the thumbnail of the pumpkin itself. If I do want to get this selection over to the other side, we can look to modify or transform the selection. With the transform, I can actually reflect it. Down the bottom, I hit flip horizontal, and then I can move this over to the right side so that I can get something that is symmetrically correct. Once I have this area selected, I can hit enter or return, and then again just hit backspace to cut out that area. So it saves a little bit of trouble than trying to repeat or draw out the image with it not being accurate. But again, if I do want to fill in areas, I can look to consider adding in, say, pupils. I'm going to click and drag to create out a ovular shape inside of the eye area. And I can hold down Shift if I want to draw in 2 different areas. But the idea of this is that if I paint this area back in with the paint bucket, or go up to Edit Fill, I'm looking to fill this in with white. As we saw before, when I filled it back in, it reveals back some of the pumpkin. So when I click OK with the white, you see that it automatically fills back inside of the selected area, giving us what will be our pupils. Obviously, I can always add in more details as well. If I decided I want to have a little highlight or an element that is cut out, I can draw pupils on the inside. And again, hit backspace to cut them out. Now we can see that I have a couple circles or giving the direction that the pumpkin or jack-o'-lantern is looking. Now I'm going to draw out a nose area. And with the nose, again, I want to make sure I have the layer mask selected. So I'm going to use the polygon lasso tool to draw out the nose shape. And you can do the nose in any direction that you want. But using the polygon lasso tool, very simple, just draw a triangle and hit backspace. When it comes into the mouth, or what you want to create for a mouth shape, the polygon lasso tool is best used using smaller anchor points so you can give the sense of curves. But if I want to give teeth or the shape of a tooth, it's just a matter of clicking point by point to draw out that shape that you're looking for. If I have wide teeth, or if I want to give a variety of teeth, I can do some right next to each other. From this area, I'm just going to go back up, giving the corner of the mouth, and then I'm going to look to frame downward. Go down the bottom end. I may have teeth on some bottom. I may want to throw in even a sharp tooth if it helps break up the shape a little bit. You can try many different varieties. It's really up to you to figure out what works for your design. So if I wanted to give a little cutout on the side of his mouth as well, you can see that we're just looking to build out something that can be interesting, dynamic. And once I have this area drawn out, again, I have the layer mask selected. Simply hit backspace or delete. And we get out that cutout inside the shape. And again, I'm not filling it in with black. If I were to hide the black background, we see that it's transparent in this area. But now we want to look to fill in what will be the glow inside of the pumpkin. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call it glow. I'm going to use the polygon lasso tool to draw around the outsides of the face, from the mouth, around the eyes. You could always use the elliptical marquee tool as well, but this just makes sure that I'm selecting around the entire space. And then I'm going to go over to switch my paint bucket to the gradient tool. With the gradient tool, I currently already have a red to yellow gradient. This can be found under the orange default settings, which we can always get into customizing this as well. But if I'm looking at the default settings, this is the 5th one over on the right side of the dropdown. So to fill this in, I'm going to switch this over to a radial gradient, so it glows outward. When I click and drag, you see that it is radiating from red to yellow. I actually want to switch this direction. So I'm going to reverse this over on the top navigation. I can uncheck reverse, or go over to the right side in the properties panel and click reverse as well. And the idea of this is, yes, it's currently filling in front of my face. I'm just going to move this layer underneath of my face. And when I do move this down, we can see a glow effect happening, but the pumpkin is a little bit too light to really identify and see the glowing effect. So what we're going to look to do is select on the pumpkin thumbnail, not the layer mask, the pumpkin thumbnail itself on the layers panel. And we're going to go up to image at the top navigation, down to adjustments, and go down to exposure. With exposure, you don't have to modify your settings too far, but if I drop down my exposure, we start to get a darker variation of the pumpkin. I'm also going to drop down the offset very slightly just to bring back some vibrance into the image, because if I were just dropping down the exposure, it becomes a little bit too muted. So about negative 1.5, 1.45 helps us to create out a separation. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide what is going to be the best glow for you. So once I'm satisfied with this, I can hit OK. Now we can get into adding the three-dimensionality. For the three-dimensionality, it's a matter of understanding your perspective. Particularly, we're going to be using one-point perspective for this idea. And I'm going to create a new layer just so we can see and understand one-point perspective a little bit better. I'm going to rename a new layer 1 point. And I'm just going to put a little white dot for us to reference and identify. I'm going to shrink down my brush using the left bracket. And the idea is whatever lines I draw for perspective, it's all going to connect back to this single perspective point right in the middle between his eyes. So when I drew all this, this is going to be on its own separate layer. So if I want to protect it for right now, I can lock it just to make sure I don't accidentally draw on top of it. But once I have this, I'm going to look to create a new layer for my first gradient and giving the width and thickness of the eye cutout. The idea is that we're going to create perspective inside the eyes to make it look like we're seeing the wall of the actual pumpkin. The interior would have thickness to it. It wouldn't just be very flat, very open. So I'm going to go down to the bottom of the layers panel, create a new layer. And with this, we're going to have multiple different layers. So just understand that you don't have to get into naming each one. We can eventually organize these so that they are on their own specific folders. But I'm going to zoom in just so we can see the overall look and feel. I'm going to click over on the polygon and lasso tool. With the polygon and lasso tool and the new layer, the eye cutout that I currently have, right now it is above our jack-o'-lantern layer, but you'll see where I move it shortly. The idea of this, I'm going to start down in the corner outside of the eye and move towards this 1 point perspective right in the middle of the eyes. What I want to do is look to get the same angle following where the line would be, but just shorten it so it's just giving a little bit of thickness inside the wall of the pumpkin. Once I have this, I'm going to click a point, and then I'm going to run a parallel line to the outside left edge. Keeping parallel gives me the thickness of the wall and maintains consistency of how that thickness that is. Then I'm going to go around and back to where I started to give us a sense of where the wall thickness will be. Once I have this area drawn out with the polygon and lasso tool, I'm going to click on the gradient tool. And with the gradient tool, again, I do have this yellow to orange. I'm going to just change this from a radial gradient to a linear gradient. And I'm going to click and drag outward to give me some warmth on the outside or inside of this cutout area. But so it transitions from a lighter color to a darker color. And even though this doesn't look like it matches up very well, the idea of this is that this eye cutout is eventually going to move underneath of our jack-o'-lantern layer. And when I do move it, we can see that it now sits inside of the pumpkin, giving us that depth inside. Once I have this, I'm going to go back over the polygon lasso tool. I need to create a new layer for the next cutout. I'm going to do the bottom portion of the wall. The reason why I'm doing the bottom portion of the wall is because it's below the perspective line. This 1 point perspective, everything below it, you would be seeing the top view of things. So we'll see this definitely down on some of the teeth, as well as portions of the eye and nose as well. But again, we're running a parallel line to the bottom edge. I'm going across, and then back to where I started. And again, remember, we created a new layer. If you don't create a new layer, it's going to end up messing up the gradient that we just created. But with a new layer, I can click and drag and create out the next variation or gradient to show the depth inside of the eye. And see, when we click and drag, or if I click off of it, we now have the wall on the left side and bottom of the eye. Now we need to do the pupil of the eye. Again, we're creating a new layer. Back over the polygon lasso tool. I'm going to go to the top edge of the eyeball. Top edge of the eyeball is relatively even to the 1-point perspective. So I'm just going to shorten it up, and then I'm going to round running parallel to the right side of this pupil. I click point by point. But when I get down to meeting the bottom edge here, this is going to relatively align to the perspective of this bottom point, giving me the corner angle for this pupil area. And again, with a new layer, back to the gradient tool, I'm going to click and drag, creating out the gradient. It's going to set my pupil thickness. We do have the inside of the pupil as well, this little dot. With the polygon lasso tool, again, creating out a new layer. I'm just going to give a rounded area reflecting the left curve of this eye, and then around, back to where I started, using the gradient tool to draw this out. So when I click off of this, we can see that we now just added thickness to this left eye. If you do have a mirror image over on the right side, you could look to reflect those same pieces over to the other side. I know that everything will match up except for the inside of the pupil. But if I wanted to replicate and duplicate these layers out, I'm going to select the 4 layers, right click on the layers, and duplicate these layers. With them duplicated, I can hit Control T, right click on the selected area, and flip horizontal. With them flipped, I'm going to drag them over to the right side. And you can see they do not match up exactly. So it is a matter that we're going to have to go back through cleaning up some lines. And the gradients have to be redone. So just understand that even though you think that they may be accurate, sometimes they are not. I'm going to shift these pieces over so I can see them a little bit better. They still match the correct perspective. But I will have to select on the gradient again to redraw these out. And you just want to hit the eye icon to figure out what layer you're working with, and then you can redraw the gradient as needed. Bottom of the eye, and then the right side. So now we have the eyes completed. We can go down to the nose. Again, I'm going to look to create out a new layer. But if you do want to keep your layers organized, I can select out the layers that make up the right eye and add a new folder and rename this right eye. So if I were to hide this layer, all the thickness of the right eye disappears. And then these 4 layers would make up the left eye, or to the right eye to the jack-o'-lantern's view. But again, I'm going to create a new folder. We'll say left eye, as we're looking at it. So it's easy to identify what pieces go to what cutout. So now we're going to look to create a new layer and build out the nose shape. The nose shape, I'm going to click on the polygon lasso tool. I'm going to start at the bottom cusp or cutout area of the nose and go back to the direction of the 1-point perspective. Just shorten it up, and again, I'm running parallel to the left edge of this nose. Once I have that area drawn out, gradient tool, click and drag, then creating out a new layer for the next pieces. So using this video, feel free to stop, pause, go back as needed if you need to, or skip ahead if you are now comfortable with the process. Create out a new layer for the mouth. With the mouth, I do want to do the bottom portion of the mouth first. I do have a couple more complicated parts with the bottom ridges. But again, the idea of this is that we're giving thickness to the wall. And we would not be able to see the top thickness of the wall. We would only be able to see the bottom thickness because it's below the 1-point perspective horizon line. So just understand that I'm looking to draw out the wall thickness of the bottom first, and then we can get into the details of the teeth. Once I get to the other side, I'm just going back underneath and around. Even though I did go outside of it, the idea of this, it will only be visible for certain areas. I may want to switch over to the gradient, the radial gradient, so it travels a little bit better. You can adjust the gradient as needed depending on what you're trying to create. So once I have the thickness for the bottom of the mouth, now I'm going to look to add the details for the teeth. If I'm starting with the top teeth would not be able to see the bottom perspective. But what I would be able to see is the inside perspective of the tooth. Going back to the perspective line, I would not be able to see the outside as it is hidden behind the surface of the tooth. But if I click on this point and I go back to the perspective, I have the correct angle I need. I'm going to shorten this up and run a parallel line to the vertical aspect of the tooth. Once I have that area, create a new layer. Click and drag to create out the gradient that's going to help to create that depth. Now I have the one tooth. I can go over to the right side, do this for this tooth, and again back up to the perspective, just giving us a sense of where these teeth would line up. And I could do multiple pieces at once, but it's really dependent on making sure that your gradients are correct. I'm using the same gradient over and over again, but it still gives me the standard colors that I've used throughout for the rest of the jack-o'-lantern. So back up to the perspective point. This one, I'm just going to hide the one side of the wall, or the inside of this tooth, behind this other tooth. But make sure to create out that new layer, and click and drag. And we can see that now I've added the thickness and the wall elements that make up the teeth. Now I have to do the bottom teeth. The bottom teeth are more complicated because we are dealing with perspective and seeing the top elements or top view of the teeth. We're going to do the rectangular tooth first. The triangular, more sharp tooth is going to have a little bit more complicated areas just understanding at first. But if I'm looking at this perspective back to the 1-point perspective, this is not all going to go all the way back. It's just a matter of going to the cutout area. Then I'm going to run upward and run to the top corner of this tooth area. With this, I'm going to create out a new layer and draw out the gradient. But the big idea of this is that I'm actually doing a perspective on the top of the tooth. The top of the tooth needs to, again, go back to the 1-point perspective, but cut over and meet to the left side to give us this top surface area. I'm going to click on the gradient tool, create out a new layer, click and drag. If I want a darker area, see, I just have to modify my gradient until I'm satisfied with the gradient and how it travels. The right side of the tooth we don't see because it's behind the surface of the wall. But now we go over to the top point and dealing with this direction. Again, I'm just going to shorten this up. I'm going to run parallel to the right side of the sharp tooth until it runs into the surface area where the wall is, and then I can connect down to the corner of where the tooth starts. Again, I'm creating out a new layer. I'm using the gradient tool to draw this out. Over on the right side, it really depends on the perspective that you have. You can see that mine does go slightly back to the 1-point perspective. So I do have to still draw this aspect of the tooth, and it is going to connect over to this right side. Again, I have to create a new layer for this perspective. So when I click off of this and then we take a look out, we have created perspective for a standard jack-o'-lantern shape. If I hide out the 1-point perspective before getting into submission, you can see that we just have a standard looking jack-o'-lantern, but we eventually do probably want to add in some glow effects, make this stand out or come off a little bit more interesting. With glow effects, there are many different ways of going about this. First way is possibly creating out a new layer. I'm going to use the polygon lasso tool to draw around the area of my eye. It doesn't have to be perfectly accurate. It is just getting a representation of where the eye would be glowing. I'm just kind of rushing through this, but you can take your time to get it as accurate as you like. We're going to fill this in with a brighter yellow. I can use the paint bucket tool. Do a yellow-orange color. I fill inside that area. I can deselect, and with this selection, I'm going to first look to see what happens when I blur it out. I go up to Filter at the top of navigation, down to Blur, and then Gaussian Blur. With Gaussian Blur, you can see that at a radius, it gives this glowing effect around the outside edge, but it also does hide the perspective inside of my eye contents. So if I push my glow effect up more, or the Gaussian blur up more, you can see I'm at 30 pixels at this moment. We can still see the three-dimensionality inside of the eye, but we're actually getting the glow effect happening outside of this eye as well. You can kind of toy around with it until you're satisfied, but just understand if you push it too far, it disappears completely. If you don't push it up high enough, you lose the interior perspective. So about 30 pixels for this one isn't bad. What I can take a look at once I'm satisfied with that glow effect is if the blend modes help to add to it or take away from it. Going over to, say, screen mode gives me a better glow, and I can still maintain and see the effect happening within the design. If you want more of an orangish tone, you can see how it's going to affect the overall look and feel. If I think of more of a jack-o'-lantern, it might pull off this overlay color. So just understand that you can switch between different settings. It's a matter of what you'll ultimately think will look best for your design. So if I wanted to keep this with, say, the overlay look, I'm going to keep that for right now, and I'm going to duplicate this layer because I know it relatively matches over the right side. Right click on the layer, duplicate layer, hit OK. You can see when I duplicated it up, it actually helps to produce more glow as well. So I may want to consider using that twice to get that same effect. Or what I can look to do is flip this and bring it over to the right side so it affects this part of this eye as well. So I'm just trying to match it relatively to the eye over on the right side. Again, if I wanted to duplicate out these layers, it might help to produce a more glowing effect. For the nose area, I'm going to use the magic wand to select inside of the nose. Just understand If I just go with the polygon lots tool, I can click point by point and then create out the new layer for this nose feature. So creating a new layer, filling it in with its yellow, deselect, and then go back up to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. It blurs out pretty well. I can see the three-dimensionality, but we are going to switch the overlay again and duplicate this layer out one more time to get that more orangish glow happening. Finally, I'll do the same thing for the mouth. With the mouth, it doesn't have to be perfect. And just understand that I can click point by point. So once I have this area, again, create a new layer, fill it in with the yellow, deselect, and again, we're going to go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, giving it that glow effect. I'm going to change it to overlay and then also duplicate it one more time. The quick way of duplicating a layer is simply clicking and dragging it onto the plus sign or the add new layer, and it automatically makes a duplicate of that layer.